Good evening. This is the India Development Debate. I'm Supriya Srinath, and with me is my colleague Sandeep Kurumurthy. An all-out trade war is clearly in the making. US President Donald Trump on Thursday ushered in steep tariffs on steel and aluminium in a move that is widely seen as protectionist in nature. The tariffs are much steeper than what the markets had anticipated, although Canada and Mexico are exempt from the trade barriers, at least as of now. Now, quite obviously, the move has invited sharp criticism from America's major trading partners, including China, which has slammed Washington for making protectionist moves in the name of national security. The damage may be limited for India, at least as of now, but industry veterans like Sajjan Jindal feel our policymakers should take a leaf out of President Trump in protecting the domestic steel industry.
But economists warn that India will be caught in the crossfire as many trade and non-trade barriers come up between its business partners if a full-fledged trade war does break out. So what are the options before the Modi government? As noted, economist and ET Now's consulting editor Swaminathan had pointed out, is lying low in a raging war between two of the world's largest economies the best policy? The repercussions of the US-China trade war and what it means for India, that's our topic of discussion tonight on the India Development Debate. Joining us on the show this evening, Ambassador Meera Shankar, former diplomat to US, Pradeep S. Mehta, Secretary General, Cuts International, Rajat Nag, Distinguished Fellow at the NCAER, Ajay Sahai, DG and CEO at the Federation of Indian Export Organization, and Gurcharan Das, author, commentator, and former CEO of PNG India. Rajat Nag, let me start off with you really. How big a threat is this entire move by Trump to the rules-based world trade order that we've seen now for several decades? How big a threat is this to that?
I think it's quite a serious threat, actually. And with due apologies to Kipling, I feel that if the rest of the world can keep its head when one particular country is obviously losing its, is going to be very important. It's not so much the steel or the aluminium or one particular product. In any case, India is a very minor player in the steel and aluminium imports into the US. India accounts for less than 2% of the steel imports by US and also aluminium. But it is more the systemic threat to the world trade order. If this then results in some trade war, retaliation, and which of course you expect countries to do this, I think it's a race to the bottom. And I think it can be a very serious issue for the world at large. And I just hope that better sense will prevail.
Ambassador Shankar, I want to come to you. Professor Nag there believes that this could be a systemic threat to the world trade order, to the world economic order. Are you somebody who shares that concern? Do you believe this could be as disruptive as that, something that could disrupt the world trade order as we've seen it?
Well, it can undermine the trading system that has been established through the WTO. But we have to see how it develops, whether there's retaliatory action and counter-retaliatory action, then it poses the threat of escalation. But as of now, I gather that it might be limited in the sense that the EU has said that it might impose retaliatory tariffs on about $3 billion worth of US imports into the EU. China has said it would be justified in taking action. And of course, countries are also going to look at dispute resolution. The Trump administration has also left a small window for negotiation, saying, countries could seek exemption in discussions with the US Trade Representative's office. So it's possible that the EU might avail of that window to open trade discussions with the US on it. But it does pose it does have the potential of undermining the world trading system.
Oh yes, it does have a potential of undermining the world trading system. But Pradeep Mehta, just to put this in perspective, at least this action that has caused this furor in the international market, 25% tariff on steel and 10% on aluminum imposed by US. Is it really going to cause so much of turmoil in the global economy? At the end of the day, they account for just $2.5 trillion of imports. That's, about 0.2% of the American GDP. So is this really going to cause so much of turmoil as it is being made out to be?
I suspect it could, as has been voiced by the two previous commentators, Meena Shankar and Rajat Nag, I thought, I heard. It could lead to trade war and it could cascade. The problem with any action like this is on the grounds of national security, which is a very weak ground that the US would look at. And I don't think they are assessing the impact of such tariffs on their own consumers. I mean, any white good manufacturing or cars, etc., they're all going to go up the cost of production. And therefore, any such move by any country has to be thought very clearly, and this is one of the reasons why the Trump's chairman of the Economic Advisory Council, Mr. Cohn, resigned from his, took a very drastic step. And yet, President Trump decided to go ahead with a very ill-advised step.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that. But I think one of the things that people said on Gary Cohn's departure and exit was that his departure put an end to all speculation that Mr. Trump's mind could be changed. That perhaps was the final nail in the coffin and he had to go. But Gurcharan Das, Ambassador Shankar spoke about something which was prominent, that we'll have to see how disruptive it will be depending on what kind of retaliatory measures are taken across the world, and then what does America do in response to all of that. Do you see a lot of tit-for-tat escalations? The EU said it would retaliate with sanctions on Harley. Trump has threatened to retaliate further. Where is this actually headed, this whole tit-for-tat retaliatory action, and how much of this are we actually going to see?
Well, this is a very dangerous moment in world trading history. You are about to undo the lot of good that was done at the end of the Second World War, and which we have had for 70 years. I would say that enough, in Economics 1, the first thing you learn is that trade is good and free trade is even better. And when you practice free trade, you really work for the citizens of the country. When you try to impose high tariffs, then you're working for the producers. Now, the citizens are always the majority, producers are always a minority. So it behooves every government to work for the majority of the people. And we've seen how much damage trade wars have done. The years, if you just remember that between the First World War and Second World War, those were the years when you had these trade wars, and how they brought about partly the global recession. So this is very, very dangerous, and Mr. Xi in China is not a weak man. He is flexing his muscles all around, and I wouldn't be surprised if he declared duties on mainly the American agricultural goods, corn, soya, wheat. And for India, ultimately, this is a very sad thing, because India needs to grow at 8% and plus to wipe out poverty, to be able to become a middle-class country. And no country achieved that. We can't grow at higher than 80% on a sustained basis unless you export. And if people start retaliating, and today, this is our moment when the structure of the economy is good, the recovery is taking place, but India's share of global trade, which is about 16.5 trillion, is only 1.7%. So we are ones who desperately need an open trading order. And finally, let me just say that this is the best thing you could do for your farmers. We've played protectionist, but the opposite should be the policy, where you give farmers a stability in terms of policy for export, so they have a bigger market to work with.
Okay. Rajat Nag, comment on that, this whole, fear of tit-for-tat escalations, fear that this could escalate into a full-blown trade war. What's your own sense? Is it a given that we will see bilateral retaliatory attacks? Is that a given? How bad could it get really?
Well, I think you will probably some bilateral retaliatory attacks, say between EU and the US, though even there I hope there will be cooler heads which will prevail. But my concern is if it becomes multilateral, and this is why I think it's very important that the rest of the world unites and makes sure that we don't get into, say, a diversion of products from one country to another. China, for example, exporting steel into the US and then finding some tariffs, tries to then push it into other countries, say India. Those sort of things will be even more dangerous. So what I'm hoping that the WTO and other rule-based organizations will be able to keep such retaliatory attacks essentially, well, minimal. But even if they happen on a bilateral basis and not make it multilateral, which then becomes an all-out trade war.
We're all keeping our fingers crossed that it should not be a multilateral all-out trade war, but just hold your thoughts there. I've got Ajay Sahai from the Federation of Indian Exporters also joining us. And Mr. Sahai, how concerned are Indian exporters? You were just about coming out from the woods. Exports were just about beginning to pick up, and now you're seeing a potential full-blown trade war that the world could be engulfed into. My question really is, how concerned are you of that? Is the concern related only to the trade barriers that are coming up in the US, or are you actually concerned that retaliatory action across the world, especially in the EU or China, is perhaps going to perpetrate this even further and add to our woes?
No, in fact, we are very closely watching the developments. US is extremely important partner for India. Our bilateral trade of goods and services are expected to the tune of around $140 billion. And we also have a trade surplus of around $35 billion with the US. Let us see how this kind of trade war further develops, because I personally feel that it may be confined to few trading partners, and unless the trading partners retaliate in a very alarming way, I personally feel that this is more symbolic in nature rather than seeing the actual impact on that. Right now, US is looking into targeting steel and aluminium sector. On these sector, my market penetration in US is not very much. We export steel and share our is around 1.2%. In aluminium, it is around 1.5%. But definitely we are very, very careful, because US is the biggest market for India's traditional sector of export, be it leather, be it textile sector, or be it the gem and jewelry sector. From that perspective, definitely we are concerned, and that's why we are keeping a very close watch. And in fact, we also have to closely monitor our imports as well, because if the market is not available to some countries in the US or vice versa and other trading partners, there are equal chances that such goods may be diverted to other countries, and India may be one of such countries.
Yeah, that's a valid concern you've raised as well. We could see a lot of dumping of goods that could come through. But Ambassador Shankar, an important point is that these tariffs, and you'll understand this better, have been imposed using grounds of national security. Is America, in some sense, setting a very dangerous precedent for other countries to follow?
Well, I think Pakistan has already used this as an excuse not to extend MFN to India. They use the national security argument, but we haven't taken a dispute to the WTO on that. Yes, for the major trading partners and major trading nations, this is something new, to use national security as a ground for imposing tariffs. And President Trump said that the US wants to build its airplanes and ships and weapons using steel manufactured in the US. And that's the reason they've given, for it being a national security issue. When it goes to the WTO, even if it goes to the WTO for dispute settlement, this whole question of the national security argument, we don't know how it is going to play out. And the whole dispute settlement process is also quite prolonged, which is the reason why countries may be tempted to first impose some retaliatory tariffs and then go for dispute settlement alongside. For India, yes, previous speakers have raised the problem, possible problem of imports, of exports of steel and aluminium being diverted to India. We have safeguard duty in place at the moment against Chinese steel imports because they were selling well below price and impacting our steel industry. So that safeguard duty should in effect continue and would provide us protection against dumping of goods in the Indian market. The other way it could impact on India is that we import scrap from the US for our steel. And if US prices go up because they are making it themselves or they've imposed tariffs, then the scrap that we import will also become pricier and therefore impact the prices of domestic steel manufacturing. But otherwise, India is a large economy with a very large domestic production base. And hopefully, as our economy recovers, we should be able to generate demand for our steel products. And there are other markets outside the US as well.
Fair point. We have an entire segment where we will dedicate and put all our attention, and the discussion will steer towards the India impact and what should India be actually doing. Can we afford to be ambivalent or do we have to take a stance? We'll discuss all of that in just a bit. But I want to put the global scenario, the perpetrators of this behind us before we go there. And Mr. Mehta, if I may come to you, Pradeep Mehta, much depends on China's response. It has been said time and again on this debate and this discussion that what will China do? How is China going to respond? Do you believe it's China's action that will eventually determine whether this really becomes a full-blown trade war?
I'm quite sure that China is going to react very adversely with this thing because the tariffs are basically aimed at Chinese steel and not so much as European steel, etc. Secondly, I think an important aspect which has been highlighted in your the captions which are coming is the integrity of the WTO dispute settlement system. Appellate body, there are 3 appointments which are still pending, which the US has not yet confirmed. So adding on to, even if there is a dispute and the fact is that the national security argument is very weak, even if it does go to dispute, by the time it comes to the appellate body, and the appellate body is not yet fully in place. At the moment there is a quorum of 4 members and 3 vacancies are there. So, and by August and September there would be 2 more vacancies, which is just round the corner. And what would happen to those disputes? And they can hang in the mid-air. And therefore, the whole integrity of the world trading system is at peril because of the kind of attitude which the US has adopted, and it's not just the retaliatory, the tariff issues alone, which is therefore what our worry is now. Next week itself, India has called a mini ministerial, and I don't think the US TR is coming, but at least the US Assistant Trade Representative is coming. It is not many ministers are coming to this meeting, but I hope that this particular mini ministerial which India is hosting would be able to articulate the need to restore integrity of the world trading system, and that too I think is an important aspect that one has to keep in mind. And not just the tariff issues.
Indeed. Gurcharan Das, is that the big thing, the need to restore the integrity of the WTO? I mean, that itself, the WTO itself has been under strain and, in some sense is yet to recover from the collapse of the Doha round in 2015. It's critical to restore the integrity of the WTO process, isn't it?
Absolutely. As far as India is concerned, multilateralism is always better than bilateralism. And I'm sorry to say, but India has not played a positive role in history in the past in these WTO negotiations. The reality is, now just look at it, the last budget raised tariffs on 40 products. This followed on some key products that we raised tariffs in December. So India is not a model of a enlightened trader, and we should also take this opportunity to get our own minds. And we talk about distress with farmers, but one of the reasons for that distress for farmers is when they produce, they overproduce, and then the food rots because we don't have a stability policy of agricultural exports. We have this stop and start policy. So we have hurt ourselves, and India should take a lesson from this, that the basic idea that ultimately trade helps everybody, and it's not a win-lose game. And I'm not sure how much compared to the USTR. The USTR is very upset with India for having behaved the way we have in the last few months, in the sort of in the name of make in India, the kind of tariffs that we have brought. So I just think that we need some soul searching ourselves as well.
Right. No, I think we are putting the spotlight on whether we've also actually fallen trapped to the protectionist trend in the budget this year, and that soul searching within. We will discuss and debate that in a moment from now, and also flourishing or floundering relations with the US as well. But Professor Nag, the WTO, like Sandeep pointed out earlier, is already under strain. Questions have been raised on how toothless and ineffective it is, and it, of course, has to yet recover from the collapse of the Doha round in 2015. But are we likely to see an immediate collapse, or do you think a gradual erosion perhaps is the more likely scenario?
That's a very good point, and I worry about that. WTO already sort of appears weak. The Doha round hasn't come through. The world at large, I don't think, has been able to come to grips with some of these larger multilateral issues. And then comes the US, which is supposed to be one of the global leaders in this whole discussion, doing things which are really very, very counterproductive and very myopic. So yes, I think this does mean that an organization like WTO comes under tremendous pressure, and this is where I think countries like India and China and EU need to rise above their narrow national interests and look at the larger global order. I think the tariffs that Mr. Trump has imposed, no matter how they're applied, as he said, with love or otherwise, it's a very serious threat to the global economic order. And if the countries individually start to sort of, fight amongst themselves, not only WTO is weakened, I think the entire economic system is under threat on the global scene.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador Shankar, what obviously this does is that it's going to put a lot of pressure on the WTO's resolution machinery. Is it, because more conflicts will come through, and that's sort of a given as a fallout of what's going on. How capable, how competent, and I think, one of our speakers touched upon it earlier as well, is there capacity in the WTO, machinery to sort of address the conflicts, dispute resolution conflicts that are likely to come through from here on?
Well, I think, the WTO for the first time established a rules-based international order, which actually was helpful to the developing countries, because otherwise on a purely bilateral basis, it was always the asymmetry of power which determined outcomes on disputes. So for the first time, you had an international rule-based system which also had a dispute resolution mechanism. And this has been fairly robust in the past, including judgments against fairly powerful economies like the US in the past. The issue is that it's a fairly prolonged process, and right now the appellate tribunal of the dispute settlement mechanism at the WTO doesn't have its full quorum. It has vacancies, and some more vacancies are due to arrive. So if it doesn't have its full quorum to actually operate, then it could be in a limbo for some time. But otherwise, I would say that the WTO dispute resolution process has been fairly robust. It's not that their judgments are implemented, But if those judgments are not implemented by the country against whom the judgment is given, then the plaintiffs have the right to impose proportionate penalties through raised duties or whatever against that particular country as part of the WTO process.
Right.
So it actually, what it does is to bring about an orderly resolution of disputes, and it sets the rules of the game. So when you talk about the WTO process being weakened, yes, in terms of being able to expand the areas of free trade, it's been weakened.
Right.
But in terms of implementing what has already been agreed upon, it's been a reasonably robust system.
Sure.
Now what you're seeing is that the actual system as it exists, not just looking to the future and expansion and, you know, so on, but the actual system as it exists is being undermined. India's duties, by the way, in the budget are within our bound rates, you know, because when we bound our tariffs at the WTO, we kept cushion to be able to raise them in case there was a problem. So we really haven't gone against our WTO
Commitments.
That's right.
commitments.
And that bound rate has been adhered to.
Yeah.
Fair point, Ambassador Shankar. I'll come back to you in just a bit. But Ajay Sahai, if I may come to you, this notion of reciprocal tax that President Trump keeps talking about. You know, if India is going to tax Harley at 50%, this whole notion of reciprocal tax that Mr. Trump threatens the world about. How feasible is it, A, and how exactly do you believe it's going to impact India?
No, in fact, when you are talking about the taxes, if you are going by the WTO discipline, it has to be on MFN basis. So you can't target a particular country when you are raising the tariff. If you have the elbow room between your applied tariff and the bound rate of tariff, you can definitely increase it, but on an MFN basis. I personally feel that US is not targeting India because our trade deficit with the US is only to the tune of around $35 billion. Indian aviation industry is doing very well. We have placed record out of the Boeings which will be supplied in next few years or so. US has emerged as an exporter of petroleum products. We are importing petroleum goods worth $80 billion. And that's why I personally feel that in next few years, we will seeing that this trade deficit of $35 billion will definitely be reducing year by year. And that's why I personally feel that US may not target India because our trade deficit with US is manageable. And I personally feel that in years to come, this will further reduce by a significant margin.
Okay, let's now sort of in a more granular manner analyze the impact on India really to get things started. And Mr. Mehta, how perturbed should countries like India really be? You know, Anand Mahindra tweeted yesterday saying that India has nothing to fear even if there's a trade war, given the size of our domestic economy. Do you take comfort in the size of our domestic economy to say that India has not much to fear, or do you believe that if this escalates into a trade war, even India will pay a heavy price?
No, you see, when as the very famous metaphor, if there are two elephants fighting, the grass does get trampled or crumpled. So one cannot ignore the fact is that India could be a victim of a trade war or tariff war between US and China and US and Europe as well. And I think let me go back to a few points which have been made earlier. Indeed, our own policy of raising tariffs in the last budget has not been very thought out of. There have been no stakeholder consultations also, except that one can see very clearly that there are lobbies working on it, and that is again, in my opinion, not a very smart thing to do. Especially when we require to grow our economy. Secondly. The fact is that, there's one disagreement I have with one of the commentators. I thought it was Gurcharan Das who said that India has not been supporting multilateralism. In fact, we are one of the very strong supporters of multilateralism, except that we feel that we've been given the short end of the stick insofar as the Doha agenda is concerned. But we need to move on, and that is what our government has to understand. That we need to move on, and ultimately, as was also voiced by people, it's the integrity of the world trading system which is at stake, not just the tariff issues. And there are many such issues which we need to think very carefully, and I'm sure our Minister Suresh Prabhu is quite quite sort of, I would say, well informed about it. It's quite capable about dealing with the bigger picture, but how India can play in a evolving, and the fact is that after the collapse of the Buenos Aires ministerial, any country, if it has taken a call to call a mini ministerial, it is India, and that itself should be sufficient evidence. But I don't agree with the policy measure of raising our tariffs, which has come in for criticism, and not only by USTR but anybody else, including facing retaliatory tariffs even from a country like Indonesia. And we've raised tariffs on palm oil, for example. We raised tariffs on pulses. Now, again, have we thought about it very carefully? Do we have sufficient domestic capacity to grow the pulses? We'd always be very short, and now we go ahead and raise, I mean, so these kind of ad hoc measures which are only going to disturb the market and can have very adverse impact on our future needs as such. And therefore, I strongly advise that we need to have a better understanding about many of these issues, which unfortunately is currently lacking. And by the way, Ajay Saha spoke about trade deficit with US. We've done a calculation. The trade deficit with US is not actually $35 billion, but on a value-added basis, it is around $15 billion. And that is something which we need to talk to the US about. Such, and the trade deficit will come down, as he has himself pointed out. It's not only Boeing, but several other defense equipment that we're going to purchase from the US, which are there in the pipeline or on the planning board, is going to reduce the trade deficit substantially with the US. So India is not in a position to be worried about any kind of US action on India. But the fact is that, as I said, when two elephants fight, then the grass gets trampled, and that is what our worry is, because you never know how people react or behave in a very uncertain market.
Yes, you're right. People behave in an uncertain manner, and we don't want the grass to be trampled when two elephants fight. We wish that fight weren't to happen. But Professor Nag, that's one side of the argument, and Ms. Mehta here does believe that India doesn't have too much to worry about. But how perturbed do you believe India should be? How disturbed should India be? How concerned should it be? Or do you believe we can really find solace, we can really find comfort in the size of our own domestic economy? I mean, everybody talks about the India consumption story. Do you believe that's where we can find comfort and solace, or do you believe we have reasons to worry?
If you are referring specifically to steel and aluminium, which are the two products in question now, the answer would be not much. India exports less than 10% of its production of steel, and there's a large domestic market, as you say, and a growing demand. But I think the issue is beyond just these two products. If there is a trade war, it's not going to be limited to just these two products. It's going to spill over into others, including services, which of course something that India is very much affected by if it were to sort of lead to trade war in those sectors as well. So I think in the macro sense, as a global economic leader, as a growing economic leader, I would say India should be very concerned, and India should use its own diplomatic efforts to see that the issues do not get out of hand. So at a narrow micro level, maybe not to be concerned because of the size of the Indian economy, but on larger sets of issues, India should play a very important role to make sure it doesn't get out of hand.
Ajay Saha, if there were to be a trade war, like Professor Nag pointed out, do you see it spilling over to other products and services as well, which could in turn affect India severely? Is that the big concern, the spillover effect? Because like you pointed out as well, it's not about these duties on steel and aluminium that are going to hit India bad. It's the likely spillover effect of a likely trade war on products and services that are critical to India from an export point of view.
I am particularly concerned because if it translates into a trade war, it will impact the growth of the global trade. and India's exports are more attuned to the growth in the global trade. In all these years when we have done well were the year when the global trade was also improving. So if the rate of the global growth comes down, it will be definitely impacting Indian export in general. But definitely I agree that if it translates into the trade war, we will have challenges on the services front as well. And that's definitely a cause of concern for us, because we derive huge satisfaction and the trade surplus on the services front to manage our merchandise trade deficit. That I'm not of the view that we should be unduly perturbed about these development, but we should definitely be closely watching the development, because if it translates into the trade war, then definitely we have reason to be concerned with that.
Ambassador Shankar, you know, if there were to be a full-blown trade war, my question really is, what should India's stance really be? Can we afford to be ambivalent? Can we afford to not have a stance? Or is it in our best interest to perhaps join a bloc that's challenging the US position? I mean, can we afford to at all be ambivalent and be a mere spectator amidst this all?
Well, I think really we have to first wait and see how this whole issue plays out. It would be premature to start thinking of joining a bloc. But if you see our response at the official level, it has been through a statement by Ambassador Deepak, who is our ambassador to the WTO, saying India shares the concern of other countries about the US action. It's been reasonably restrained, but expressing concern about the US action. So I think we have to first wait and see how this develops before taking a view, but we should certainly be alert and monitoring developments in this regard, and also consulting with other trading partners who are impacted on how they propose to respond and what that may mean for the global trading system. I think the worry for us is that it says something about, you know, Mr. Trump's firm belief in protectionism as a way to regrow the US economy. And therefore, the question is it going to stop here? Is it going to go further? He himself has talked of reciprocal tariff, and in that he has mentioned both China and India. Now, when people say India needn't worry, yes, if you look at the hard facts, because our trade surplus with the US is just a fraction of the Chinese trade surplus. Chinese trade surplus is $375 billion, more than the entire trade between India and the US in both goods and services. India's surplus would be in the region of $35 billion, taking both goods and services into account. So, you know, you're looking, what is the order of issues you're looking at? But what happens within the US political system is that there are constituencies, and I think Mr. Trump, in taking this decision, is playing to his constituency, also in light of the upcoming, you know, congressional elections, which will come up at the end of this year. And in that process, because China has enough economic heft to be able to counterbalance US moves, then India tends to get sideswiped, because you have whetted the appetite of certain constituencies, you're unable to deliver on China, which is what really matters, then you sideswipe India. I think that is the danger for India. Not in real terms that it makes a difference, but politically it becomes expedient, because, you know, India's ability to really hurt the US is very limited.
Indeed. Gurcharan Das, closing comments from our panelists, and you touched upon it earlier as well. In some sense, what this makes me realize is that protectionism is indeed the new normal. I mean, India itself, like you pointed out, has resorted to harsh customs duties in the budget, and Ambassador Shankar said it's well within our sort of WTO commitment. But increasingly, economies, both developing and developed, you know, will want to take steps to be seen as acting to protect domestic industry. These steps are being politically sold as steps to protect domestic industry, you know, to target a domestic audience, and that's worrying, because both domestic, both developing and developed countries are seeing merit in this whole protectionism argument. Is this going to be the new normal?
Well, this is where I think we should try and understand why has the world moved in this direction, whether it's Brexit or whether it's Mr. Trump, and the India's role we have to understand, first of all, that we have a uniquely young population. That uniquely young population can deliver a major demographic dividend. But that dividend will only come if our growth rate goes above 8. And to get that growth rate above 8, the lesson is that we need the world market. The domestic market will not be able to achieve it. So we have to put exports as a priority, and I fear that we don't do that. Secondly, you need leaders today in the world, leaders like Bill Clinton and Tony Blair, who changed the mindset of their countries. Bill Clinton, when he was fighting for NAFTA, or Tony Blair, when he was making the Labour Party much more market friendly, they both argued the benefit that trade is a win-win game. And what we need are voices, whether it's Mr. Modi or whether it is who else there is in the world. These voices have to speak up right now that this sort of trade wars, protectionism harms everybody. And particularly for India, because we have, that demographic dividend could become a disaster if we can't get jobs for them. And for the jobs, we need the export market. And it's really very sad that 1.7% of global trade only India has, it's very, very sad.
Right. It is indeed sad that we have a very, very small pie of the global trade basket. But Mr. Pradeep Mehta, I'm going to ask you the question that Sandeep put forward to Gurcharan Das, that whether it's a developed market like the US or a market like India, we espouse globalization on the world stage. The Prime Minister speaks about it in Davos. And then we, of course, take a step to increase our own duties back home here in India in the budget. Is this the new normal, where there will be this race to protect in the name of nationalism, in the name of national security, in the name of domestic industry, but we will resort to this perhaps the world over?
Well, as I said earlier, the tariff proposals in our budget are very puzzling. One argument given by the finance minister is that this is to help make in India, which doesn't make great sense either. And I fully support Gurcharan Das' point that we have to increase our exports, and for us the US market is a very big market. And therefore, how we design all our policies, both industrial policy as well as trade policy, in order to ensure that our international trade goes up. Now, when you are looking at, I'm talking about international trade and not just exports, because you still need a lot of imports in order to ensure that your exports are competitive. And therefore, if you get into a situation where there are tariffs which impact your production costs, I mean, we are not only talking about domestic reforms, which was referred to earlier, but since we are talking about international trade in this particular panel, let me focus on that we have to keep our tariffs in order to send out a signal. As I said, I mean, why raise tariffs on pulses? It is not going to help Indian manufacturing. It's only going to help Indian farmers, supposedly. But we were short of pulses in India, we were short of oilseeds in India, and suddenly we do this, which doesn't make sense to me at all. And you require wider stakeholder consultation before you take these kind of steps, which has not been happening. And let me again reiterate that India's commitment to the multilateral system is evidenced by the fact that we are the first country to have called a mini-ministerial on 19th and 20th March. And we hope that that mini-ministerial will come out with some very clear recommendations and not only on these tariff issues, but as well as the integrity of the world trading system.
Okay, Ajay.
Thank you.
Okay, Ajay, 30 seconds. You touched upon it briefly. Our whole, growth revival is now, and Gurcharan Das spoke about it as well, is a bet on exports. The government is budgeting that exports will grow at 15%. In this climate, does that look like a little far-fetched?
No, I don't. Let me just put into perspective what Mr. Gurcharan Das has said has been historically borne out. In all those years when India's GDP clocked 8% plus were the year when Indian exports have also increased by 15% plus. Secondly, I still feel that the order booking position of Indian exporters are pretty good, much better than in what is in 2015, 2016. So unless the global situation dramatically changes or there becomes extreme volatility in the currency, we are on our course to increase our export by around 15% this year. And that means I'm talking about 2018-19. Though of course there are a few challenges on the export front, particularly on account of the liquidity crunch, but I'm sure the government at the highest level is quite sensitive in the matter, and we will think that it will be sorted out. Definitely exports are today much better place than it was 2 years back, and I personally feel that these kinds of development may not affect the flow of the trade, and if it is otherwise, definitely it will have significant bearing on our exports as well.
Indeed, completely timed out, but I want to thank this wonderful panel for putting this in perspective. No need to panic seems to be the consensus view of our panel, but we need to prepare for what could well be a new normal in multilateral trade. India needs to be very careful and watchful of its own position when it comes to the new global trading order. Thank you so much to all my panelists for joining us in this special edition of the India Development Debate.
There's so much more that's coming up right here on ET Now. Thanks very much for being with us. Keep it with the channel that brings you news, views and analysis that matter.